Olá. Bom dia, todo mundo bem-vindos. Eu vou passar aqui brevemente para a professora Marta fazer passar uma informação interna, depois eu apresento aqui nos palestrantes. Tá ótimo. Bom dia a todos e todas. Eu sou Marta, professora do IRI, e a gente queria dar um recado aqui. Acho que não tem nem, né, tanta gente, mas acho que seria importante, nessa aula inaugural, falar um pouco do projeto Abdias, do Nascimento, porque Mariana, que é a nossa parte também da equipe do projeto Abdias, e Álvaro vão explicar para vocês, a gente vai estar passando um questionário do projeto para os estudantes de graduação, de pós-graduação e docentes. O projeto Abdias é um projeto que foi contemplado com uma bolsa da CAPES, que diz respeito à transversalização das questões étnico-raciais no currículo de Relações Internacionais, contribuindo para uma educação antirracista. Na verdade, esse projeto visa implementar uma diretriz curricular nacional dos cursos de Relações Internacionais, de 2017, que fala sobre a transversalização das questões étnico-raciais nos currículos. É um projeto que inclui 3 universidades, então, o IRI, o Instituto de Relações Internacionais da PUC, mais os cursos de Relações Internacionais da UFPB, da Paraíba, e também de Goiás. Tá? Então, ele também tem uma equipe que são bolsistas de pós-graduação, e aí eu vou passar, então, a palavra aqui para a Mariana, que é a pós-doutoranda do projeto, e vai falar um pouco sobre esse questionário, e depois para o Álvaro, que é aluno da graduação, e que vai falar um pouco também sobre essa importância, desse projeto.
Bom dia, pessoal. Então, acho que a primeira informação que é relevante a gente compartilhar é que o questionário ele é anônimo, Vocês vão ter a opção, caso vocês achem interessante, de participar de uma entrevista mais aprofundada, do que a professora Marta trouxe aqui, do que vocês entendem por relações étnico-raciais, de como que essas questões são trabalhadas no ensino, na pesquisa, aqui no IRI. E também é importante dizer que esse questionário ele é comissionado, ou seja, ele tem 5 categorias, a depender do nível acadêmico de vocês, ou seja, nós também vamos estar entrevistando, conversando com professores e coordenadores, então vocês vão direto para as questões relacionadas à sua realidade acadêmica. Então, tem ingressantes, intermediários e também quem já está no final do curso, os veteranos. Então, a gente também, para finalizar aqui, já que o tempo é curto, dizer da importância de participar desse projeto para que a gente tenha cada vez mais pesquisas consistentes aqui no IRI, e para que também a gente possa pensar em matrizes curriculares cada vez mais diversas, democráticas, e que alguns temas que são relevantes e importantes possam ocupar em um outro lugar na nossa disciplina.
Alô. Então, eu acho que eu estou aqui muito para passar a minha experiência própria como aluno da graduação, e sei que tem alunos também de mestrado, doutorado, que depois, justamente, mesmo a gente tendo contato com todas as teorias mainstream, as teorias mais importantes que servem a nossa realidade, acredito que muitos alunos sentem a necessidade de uma espécie de vazio, vácuo, para falar de algumas teorias que possam complementar essa visão e explicar o mundo, Então, atualmente, estou com um presencial aberto, que é uma liga acadêmica de pesquisas étnico-raciais, que eu acho que conversa muito com o projeto, porque é justamente com esse formulário que a gente vai começar a compreender a transversalização do campo do saber das RIs, porque justamente o movimento que eu e alguns amigos fez foi justamente talvez sim, ter encontrado aí um espaço que não pudesse corresponder às nossas expectativas, Eu costumo dizer que o internacionalista ele tem uma missão nobre, levemente prepotente de acreditar que pode salvar o mundo, e realmente pode, de certa forma, mediar a paz, mais conflito, governança, cooperação, Só que talvez as nossas teorias tenham sido mais trabalhadas por homens brancos que tinham aquele fardo, né? O fardo do internacionalista branco, aquele fardo de que vai salvar o mundo. E talvez não contemple perfeitamente todas as questões do mundo raciais. Então, acho que é muito importante a gente discutir que tipo de relações internacionais queremos ser, né? E eu acho que é importante, se a gente quer não salvar o mundo, porque seria um fardo, e sim remediar as questões, porque o mundo já tem capacidade para se salvar também. Eu acho que é importante a gente começar a fazer essa discussão do nosso campo do saber, e é por isso que eu acredito que esse formulário não deveria nem ser opcional, deveria ser obrigatório, mas eu acho que ele é muito importante para a gente começar a pensar nisso, para, enfim, para trazer um campo de saber mais completo que possa, enfim, questionar e descrever melhor as nossas questões interestatais, né, de relações internacionais.
Bom dia a todos de novo. Eu vou aqui brevemente já transicionar para o inglês, porque é também assim, a língua do evento. Então, good morning everyone, and welcome to our Aula Inaugural for the first semester of 2026. My name is Navika Kenga, and since November of last year, I've been the director of ED. It's my great pleasure to welcome our students, faculty, and representatives of the university and other departments to PUC and to ED for what promises to be a fascinating and informative talk today. We're very lucky to have with us one of the foremost Latin Americanists in Europe, Professor Detlef Nolte from the German Institute of Global and Area Studies, GIGA. Professor Nolte is a longtime past director of the Institute for Latin American Studies at GIGA, as well as past president of GIGA itself. He's been visiting professor at USP in São Paulo, at the Universidad Católica de Chile, at Flaxo, Argentina, and Universidad de Salvador in Buenos Aires. He's also an honorary member of the Instituto de Iberoamérica at the University of Salamanca, and an associate fellow of the German Research focuses on comparative regional studies, particularly regional leaders such as Brazil, as well as institutional change in Latin America as a whole. Detlef is the author of numerous books and articles, as well as the advisor to dozens of doctoral and master's degrees. He's had profound policy impact throughout his career and helped to build a wide range of academic networks and institutions from Aula onwards. Part of his extensive networking has been more than a decade of close cooperation with ED and with PUC, where he's participated in numerous events over the years, including this week with the Jean Monnet Network event was very good for it. Professor Nolte was also instrumental in implementing the numerous exchanges of faculty and students that have strengthened this relationship over the past 15 years. Professor Nolte will speak to us today about how leading regional powers in the global south can navigate the difficult geopolitical and diplomatic waters of our current age. He'll bring his extensive experience to bear on showing how our understanding of international politics in academia can be recalibrated in our own uncertain age through a reassessment of established theories and existing analytical approaches. The aim is to help students think about how to bring the concepts and facts they learn at ED and PUC to bear on crises as far-reaching as Iran, Venezuela, and Ukraine, as well as the problems that face Brazil and Rio de Janeiro closer to home. I'd like to welcome Detlef Nolte once more, reiterate how pleased we are to be able to have him with us today in this capacity. And with that, I hand you over to our distinguished speaker.
Thank you, Kai, for the invitation. Thank you to Iri, and also thank you to very, very often for inviting me to the Oilers conference, which we have the last 2 days. It's always a pleasure for me to come to Rio de Janeiro. Over the year, I normally get a lot of invitations to come to Latin America, and I'm always thinking about, oh, it's a long flight, and then you stay some days. But when they invite me to Rio, there's no question. I always come. And I have to apologize a little bit. I will speak in English. I offered also to speak in Spanish, but I think English is better because a lot of texts and authors I will refer to have written in English, so I do not have to translate them. But later in the debate, you can also, if you speak slowly, you can also ask me in Portuguese or Portuñol or Espanol. German is also possible, but I don't think that this will happen. Okay, I will start. We live in a turbulent and rapidly changing world. The events of recent weeks and months have unfolded in quick succession, leaving little time for reflection. Donald Trump's renewed threats to annex Greenland, the destruction of alleged truck boats in the Caribbean, and the violent abduction of Venezuelan President Nicolas Maduro have contributed to a sense that the rules of international politics are shifting. The escalating confrontation between the United States, Israel, and Iran, including coordinated military strikes at Iranian targets and subsequent retaliation, has further destabilized an already fragile international environment and heightened geopolitical tensions. Last year, military action by the United States and Israel against Iran's nuclear program, along with the US trade war against much of the rest of the world, had already shaken the foundations of the international order, an order that in many respects had been eroding for some time. At the same time, other major conflicts continue with no clear resolution in sight. Russia's war against Ukraine has ended in its 5th year since the full-scale invasion in 2022. The conflict in Gaza remains unresolved, and Sudan's civil war has created one of the world's worst humanitarian crises, with millions of displaced and widespread famine threatening the population. And these are not even all of the armed conflicts currently ongoing, as for example the war between Afghanistan and Pakistan. Taken together, these developments point to a broader erosion of the international order, an order that had already been under considerable strain for some time. The accumulation of geopolitical crises, military confrontations, and economic conflicts suggests that the world is entering in a period marked by heightened instability and strategic uncertainty. The pursuit of political objectives through violence and war has once again become part of everyday international politics. At the same time, the long-standing hope that trade and economic integration would foster peace has given way to a more sober assessment. Economic interdependence is increasingly viewed not as a guarantee of stability, but as a potential vulnerability. Supply exchange can be weaponized, dependency is exploited, and tariffs deployed as instruments of political pressure. What generates uncertainty and fear in international politics also opens up an intellectually stimulating field for students of international relations, unfortunately. Our understanding of world politics needs to be recalibrated, established theories re-examined, and existing analytical approaches reassessed. Against the backdrop of the development outlined above, it is hardly surprising that realist approaches with their emphasis on power politics, strategic rivalry, and the role of the state are experiencing a new surge of interest even in Brazil. The changing international environment is forcing governments to reposition themselves and to develop new strategies. In the following, I will discuss several strategic options and refer to a number of key statements and policy documents. My aim is to provide food for thought and to encourage you, the students, to reflect on the opportunities and constraints that shape strategic choices in international politics. My aim is to have various prominent thinkers, scientists, and politicians, sometimes both at the same time, speak to you directly so you can form your own opinion about the current debate on the disruption and restructuring of the international order. I will start with this slide from the Munich Security Conference. As you might know, each year in February, there's this Munich conference where security specialists from all over the world meet to discuss the current problems of the world, screening a little bit the social media. We saw that also some colleagues from Brazil participated this year. And starting some years ago for this conference, normally they prepare a report. This is the cover of this year's reports, which have this, I think, very good title for the current times: Under Destruction, And I think we all know who is the elephant in the room. He is not our friend, or not friend, Donald Trump. And in the executive summary of this report, the authors write, read it, the world has entered in a period of wrecking ball politics, so it goes, sweeping destruction rather than careful reforms and policy correction is the order of the day. The most prominent of those who promise to free their country from the existing order's constraints and rebuild a stronger, more prosperous nation is the current US administration. As a result, more than 80 years after construction began, the US-led post-1945 international order is now under destruction. The result is a new climate in which those who employ bulldozers, wrecking balls, and chainsaws, often cautiously admired, if not openly celebrated. I think in Brazil, surely also some politicians who have this role model. And after the conference, there was also published, to say this security report. If you're interested to read it, you can download it. It's open access in the internet. And afterwards, after the conference, there was also some kind of debriefing, a much smaller paper, where the authors repeat that the order is under destruction and then derive as a result. The US has not only ceased to act as a corrective to the revisionist forces, China and Russia, chief among them, has itself also started to dismantle important rules and structures. As a result, power politics is increasingly threatening to replace international rules and principled cooperation. So where do we currently in the world? Today there are at least 3 revisionist powers contesting the current global order. Clearly, China in part is supporting the order, but it's also is trying to transform it, and it's also revisionist. And we see the conflicts in the Chinese Sea, where China is trying to expand the control, and also we don't know whether one day China will also try to occupy Taiwan by violent military. We have Russia, which is trying to re-establish the territorial control which had the Soviet Union. We see Ukraine, and I think it does speak a lot of imperialism in Latin America. I would say that in a certain way, at least from a European perspective, but especially from an Eastern European perspective, that Russia is also an imperial power which tries to re-establish the limits of its own influence. And we have the United States. I will come back later to the policy. The global south, I would say it's divided. There are a lot of countries in the global south which in part still would like to defend the current order, but also to modify and reform it in some respect to give more voice to their countries. Who are the defenders of the current global order? Maybe the European Union, but there are also some question marks. I will later present a discourse by the President of the European Commission, Ursula von der Leyen, which she gave 2 weeks ago to the diplomatic corps of the European Union. And I think also part of the countries of the global south are interested in re-establishing the global order, because it's also protection for them. If only the strong can act, and the weak not, and most of the countries are weak. So international rules give them a certain kind of protection. And now we will come to the elephant in the room. To start, the United States. There are 2 papers. If you're interested in US policy, you can read them. This is first the National Security Strategy from November 2025, and later on from January, the National Defense Strategy from the Department of War, now no longer the Department of Defense. It's also, I think, quite symbolic, this change of name. And what are they saying, so that you, as students, should know what you have to expect for the Western Hemisphere? We'll quote some parts. There's a chapter on the Western Hemisphere titled The Trump Corollary to the Monroe Doctrine, and there the document says, after years of neglect, the United States will reassert and enforce the Monroe Doctrine to restore American preeminence in the Western Hemisphere to protect our homeland and our access to key geographies throughout the region. We will deny non-hemispheric competitors the ability to position forces or other threatening capabilities, or to own or control strategically vital assets in our hemisphere. The Trump corollary to the Monroe Doctrine is the common sense and potent restoration of American power and priorities consistent with American security interests. So we are back to the Monroe Doctrine, but in a much sharper form as before. And later, the same document writes, as we deepen our partnership with countries with whom America presently has strong relations, we must look to expand our network in the region. We want other nations to see us as a partner of first choice, and we will, through various means, discourage their collaboration with others. So you should stay with the US, Europe and China should be out of the game. The Western Hemisphere is home to many strategic resources. This is also important. Now we have this contest for strategic raw materials all over the world, that America should partner with regional allies to develop, to make neighboring countries as well as our own more prosperous. And then this documents the United States must be preeminent in the Western Hemisphere as a condition of our security and prosperity, a condition that allows us to assert ourselves confidently where and when we need to do in the region. And we should also partner with regional governments and business to build scalable and resilient energy infrastructure, invest in critical mineral access. I think this will become a really important topic in the upcoming years, and harden existing and future cyber communication networks, saying that only the United States has the right to spy in the region, other countries not, that take full advantage of American encryption and security potential. And last but not least, I will finish with now, the United States must also resist and reverse measures such as targeted taxation, unfair regulation, and expropriation disadvantage US business. So domestic law in Latin America should respect US interests, as in the good old times. The terms of our agreements, especially with those countries that depend on us, must, and therefore over which we have the most leverage, must be sole source contracts for our companies. This says in the countries where the influence of the US is dominant, the countries should also do business with US companies. At the same time, we should make every effort to push out foreign companies that build infrastructure in the region, better known infrastructure, and build the one built by foreign countries. And the same we find more or less in this document of the Ministry of the Department of War. What is interesting is this last passage, which I underline, where they say that the Department of War will therefore provide the President with credible options to guarantee US military and commercial access to key terrain from the Arctic to South America, especially Greenland, the Gulf of America, and the Panama Canal. So from a US perspective, Greenland is also now part of the Western Hemisphere. I'm not a geographer, but I have my doubts that colleagues from the Geographic Department would share this opinion. So, but it's not only the US which is not only the US dominance in Latin America. The US government has also a quite particular, I would say, view of Europe. I will cite some parts of this part of this national security here, where the document says larger issues facing Europe include activities of the European Union and other transnational bodies that undermine political liberty, sovereignty, etc., censorship of free speech, and suppression of political opposition. So we see also the European Union is seen as an enemy, that institution from a US perspective. And then the Trump administration finds itself at odds with European officials who hold unrealistic expectations of the war of Ukraine, perched in unstable minority governments, many of which trample on basic principles of democracy to suppress opposition. A large European majority wants peace, yet that desire is not translated into policy in large measures because of those governments' subversion of democratic processes. After reading this, I was thinking whether I was asking for asylum in Brazil, but I can say the situation is not so bad. America encourages its political allies in Europe to promote this revival spirit and the growing influence of patriotic European parties, which means right-wing parties, indeed give cause to great optimism. And then finishing, our broad policy for Europe should prioritize cultivating resistance to Europe's current trajectory within European nations, of weakening the European Union, opening European markets to US goods and services, the same as Latin America, ensuring fair treatment of youth workers and business. Not this means not taxing these US media companies, and encouraging Europe to take action to combat mercantilist overcapacity, technological cyber espionage, and other hostile practices. So if you read this national security document, we are in Europe in democratic backsliding, and the European Union is an enemy, and you in Latin America are the zone of influence of the US. So this is the US view, but it might be also a basis for closer cooperation between Europe and Latin America. So based on this document and also the policies of the Trump administration, which we have seen in the past year and also in the first months of these years, many scientists are asking how to categorize, how to call this government. And there's a very interesting recent article, which I would also recommend to read, because it is a very good characterization, in my opinion, of the current policy of the Trump administration. This is this article which just came out, the predatory hegemon, how Trump wields American power, written by Stephen Wall, a very renowned American specialist in international relations. And what does he say? He says, Trump has been called a realist, a nationalist, an old-fashioned mercantilist, an imperialist, and an isolationist. Each of these terms captures some aspects of his approach, but the grand strategy of his second presidential term is best described as predatory hegemony. Its central aim is to use Washington's privileged position to extract concessions, tribute, displays of deference from both allies and adversaries, pursuing short-term gains in what is seen as a purely zero-sum world. And he continues, predatory hegemon is a dominant great power that tries to structure its transactions with others in a purely zero-sum fashion, so that the benefits are always distributed in its favors. Predatory hegemon's primary goal is not to build stable and mutually beneficial relations that leave all parties better off, but to ensure that it gains more from every interaction the others do. An arrangement that leaves the hegemon better off and its partners worse off is preferable to an arrangement in which both sides gain, but the partner gains more, even if the latter case yields larger absolute benefits for both parties. The predatory hegemon always wants to the lion's share. And finish with this to say, over the past 80 years, the growth structure of world politics has gone from bipolarity to unipolarity to today's lopsided multipolarity. I think it's a very good concept. We speak a lot of multipolar world, but when we have a closer look at it, we see that these are not equally strong. The US pole is still a very strong book. It's multipolar, and the Chinese too. The other poles are not so strong. So I think this concept of outside political very much. And given the United States still considerable assets and geographic advantages, predatory hegemony may work for a time, but in the long run, however, it is doomed to fail, what I also say. And then he ends up, it is ill-suited for a world of several competing great powers, especially one in which China is an economic and military peer. I'm not sure the military sphere is totally right, because multipolarity gives other states ways to reduce their dependence on the United States. And you see here the Chinese president laughing, thinking, oh, that with a long-term strategy that perhaps the Trump administration will benefit China. And I find a very interesting example for this, from this security report from the Munich conference. It shows the trade with the US and China in the Pacific. And you see the first trade, this is the percentage of trade of China and the US for the different countries. For example, in the case of Indonesia, the percentage of trade with the US is 7.2%, with China 26.6%. And for most countries, the trade share of China is much greater. And then if you move to the right or to the left, from your view, what is the average weighted tariff rate on exports? You see now with this tariff war of Trump, the Chinese tariffs are much lower than the US tariff, which in my opinion shows that in the long run, the trade share of China will increase even more, and the trade share of the US in this region will go down. So in a certain way, this would be an example of a self-defeating policy from the Trump administration. And here is also from this Munich Security Conference report. I think this is very good because we have also some surveys from important countries. So this is a survey where they asked whether or not the US is abandoning its global leadership role. You see this opinion is very strong in India, South Africa, Indonesia. It's less so in Europe or in Turkey, but still a majority. The people asked in these surveys have this opinion all over the world, and there's this the perception of Trump's policy, whether Trump's policy is good for the country. The big column is the people saying it's not good for the country. It's clear Canada was its experience of US NATO was probably there. The negative view is the strongest, but in nearly all countries, there's a negative view. In Brazil, 53% of the respondents say that it's bad for Brazil. And then there's also the question whether the US policy is dynamiting the unity of the West. And you see in the Western countries, there's a strong majority seeing that the US policy is undermining the unity of the West. The view from outside is a little bit different. And last one, also the question of whether the United States are a reliable partner in NATO, and there are also NATO states. The skepticism is growing. You see in Germany, 66% say that the US are now less reliable than before. And Canada is also quite high. And this reflects also this chart. This the financing of the war in Ukraine. You see, blue is the US, and deep blue is Europe. You see over time, now it's mostly a Europe war financed by the EU, the US support or financial support to Ukraine in the war has diminished close to zero. I will skip this. So the big question is, coming back to Lenin, what is to be done in this complicated world where the rules are changing in order, the international order is shattered. And there was preparing this conference. I was looking a little bit in the literature, and I found a lot of interesting texts from interesting thinkers. And I thought, especially for the students who start to enter international relations studies, it might be interesting to hear a little bit what they have to say. So the first document which I find interesting, which I read, is an interview with the former foreign minister and minister of defense of Brazil, Celso Amorim, from The Economist from January. And it's not an interview, it's a comment. And here he says, referring first to the intervention in Venezuela, the intervention in Venezuela raises the larger question that increasingly defines international politics. How can we live in a world without rules? Pillars of international law designed to regulate collective security, discipline world trade, and promote human rights are being undermined by all at once, the erosion once again is hard to reverse. As many have said, we find ourselves edging back towards the option of Bayesian state, where military strength is the main determinant of the country's de facto independence, in which war is once again seen as a legitimate means of change. And he continues, it is a time in which countries everywhere are rethinking their national strategy. I think that's right, also in Brazil they are doing this. The current geopolitical landscape reinforces Brazil's choice to open itself to cooperation with a wide range of partners from Latin America, BRICS and beyond. For most countries, investing in diversification of partnership, I think this is one of the big words now, and in technological autonomy is the other big word, but difficult to realize, will remain the better course. So too will continued engagement with existing multilateral institutions salvaging what can still be preserved and established norms and principles. I think this is also a shared objective of many to at least to salvage the part of the international institution. International balance depends on all actors, including Europe, having an authentic and independent voice in the world stage and contributing to a positive and open multipolarity. Brazil will continue to work with Europe, China, and others committed to multilateral institutions and the primacy of international law. So I think this is one of the possible strategies shared also with other governments. And then I think you might have heard of this, then comes this very famous speech of the Canadian Prime Minister Mark Carney in an economic forum in Davos. I think it was one day later after the publishing of this comment from Senator Amorim, and I think perhaps in future history books we will find parts of his speech, and I will cite a little bit longer from his speech because I think it's a really important document also for the students which first didn't have the opportunity to read it. And here he starts speaking to the audience. Tonight I talk about rupture in the world order, the end of a pleasant fiction and the beginning of a harsh reality where geopolitics, where the large main power is submitted to no limits, no constraints. On the other hand, I'd like to tell you that the other countries, particularly intermediate powers like Canada, are not powerless. They have the capacity to build a new order that encompasses our values like respect for human rights, sustainable development, solidarity, sovereignty, and territorial integrity of the various states. It seems that every day we are reminded that we live in an era of great power rivalry, that the rules-based order is fading, that the strong do what they can, the weak must suffer what they must. For decades, countries like Canada prospered under what we called the rules-based international order. We joined its institutions, we praised its principles, we benefited from its predictability, and because of that, we could pursue value-based foreign policies under its protection. We knew the story of the international rules-based order was partially false, that the strongest would extend themselves when convenient, that trade rules were enforced asymmetrically, and we knew that international law applied with varying rigor depending on the identity of the accused or the victim. More recently, great powers have begun using economic integration as weapons, tariffs as leverage, financial infrastructure as coercion, and supply chains as vulnerabilities to be exploited. As a result, many countries are drawing the same conclusion. They must develop greater strategic autonomy in energy, food, critical minerals, finance, and supply chains. The impulse is understandable. A country that cannot feed itself, rule itself, or defend itself has few options. When the rules are no longer protect you, you must protect yourself. Allies will diversify to hedge against uncertainty. They will, by insurance, increase options in order to rebuild sovereignty. Sovereignty that was once grounded in rules will increasingly be anchored in the ability to withstand pressure. This room knows this is classic risk management. Risk management comes at price, but that cost of strategic autonomy, of sovereignty, can also be shared. Collective investments in resilience are cheaper than everyone building their own fortress. Shared standards reduce fragmentation, complementarities are positive sum. The question for middle powers like Canada is not whether to adapt to this new reality. We must. The question is whether we adapt by simply building higher walls or whether we can do something more ambitious. To help solve global problems, we are pursuing variable geometry. In other words, different coalitions for different issues based on common values and interests. Middle powers must act together because if you are not at the table, you are on the menu. And it means reducing the leverage that enables coercion. Building a strong domestic economy should always be every government's immediate priority. Diversification internationally is not just economic prudence, it is the material foundation for honest foreign policy. Because countries earn the right to principled stance by reducing their vulnerability to retaliation. This is a longer quote. I think it was really great speech, a critical analysis of the state of the world, but also giving some hints how we can advance to change things and to create at least some kind of order in the disorder. But he was not the very first one thinking about this. There's another interesting article, which I would also like to present a little bit, especially for the students. The professors know this all. So this is a very interesting article in Foreign Affairs by Alexander Scott, an interesting guy. He is has a doctorate in international relations, and at the same time he is the president of Finland. So if you study international relations, you see the sky is open, the horizon is very bright, you can become a president. And in this article which was published at the beginning of this year, so you see many of these discourses and articles came out at the same moment. So there's this general reflection in international politics by politicians, by intellectuals, and others, what we can do in this changing of the turbulent world. So I will quote a little bit from this paper, and then I will show some figures later on. And he starts, I think, with the same diagnosis, which we know we live in a new world of disorder. The liberal, rule-based order that arose after the end of World War II is now dying. Multilateral cooperation is giving way to multipolar competition. Opportunistic transactions seem to matter more than defending international rules. Great power competition is back as a rivalry between China and the United States. That's the frame of geopolitics. But it's not the only force shaping global order. Emerging middle powers, including Brazil, India, Mexico, Nigeria, Saudi Arabia, South Africa, and Turkey, have become game changers. Together, they have the economic means and geopolitical heft to tilt the global order towards stability or greater turmoil. So it's similar as in the other speech that we heard before. There is also an expectation there are new actors, often called middle powers, could move a little bit. But sometimes I ask myself whether we now are becoming middle powers because this category is growing from time to time, although maybe that's Germany and EU are also now in this category. International institutions and norms provide a framework for global cooperation. They need to be updated and reformed to better reflect the growing economic and political power of the global south and the global east. The system is not perfect, it has inherent flaws and can never exactly reflect the world around it, but the alternatives are much worse: spheres of influence, chaos, and disorder. And the international order, however, has not disappeared amidst the wreckage. The shifting from multilateralism to multipolarity. The multipolar world risks leaving small and medium-sized countries out. Bigger powers make deals over the heads, whereas multilateralism leads to order. Multipolarity tends toward disorder and conflict. So he makes this differentiation between multilateralism and multipolarity. multipolarity. Multilateralism is much more rule-based, multipolarity is more power-based. There's a growing tension between those who promote multilateralism and an order based on the rule of law and those who speak the language of multipolarity and transfactionalism. Many states, both big and small, are pursuing what can be described as a multivectoral foreign policy, also a nice concept. In essence, their aim is to diversify their relations with multiple actors rather than aligning with any one. Without a strong multilateral system, all diplomacy becomes transactional. Multilateral world makes the common good self-interest. A multipolar world runs simply on self-interest. So they can debate this later, this differentiation between multipolarity and the multilateralism. And then he continues, this is not, everyone brings in this new concept. Finland has embraced what I have said, value-based realism, committing to a set of universal values based on freedom, fundamental rights, and international rules, while still respecting the realities of the world's diversity of cultures and histories. The global West must stay true to its values, but understand that the world's problems will not be solved only through collaboration with like-minded countries. I like also very much this value-based realism, talking with Kai about his function as director of the GIGA. I think also as this function, you sometimes need this value-based realism to manage your work. Okay, in drafting the foreign policy governments of the global West to maintain their faith in democracy and markets without insisting that they are universally applicable. In other places, different models may prevail. And even within the global West, the question of security and the defense of sovereignty will occasionally make it impossible to strictly adhere to liberal ideals. Countries would strive for a cooperative world order of value-based realism, respecting both the rule of law and cultural and political difference. So it seems that steps in country rise to strike a balance from a Western perspective, how much of our value-based view we can conserve, but on the other hand, we have to interact more with other cultures, with other worldviews to play a new, more stable order. And I will finish now with Stubbs. He says more, the aim of a value-based realism is to find a balance between values and interests in a way that prioritizes principles but recognizes the limits of states' powers and the interest of peace, stability, and security at stake. So in a certain way, peace and security get a higher value, where sometimes you have to compromise with other values. This is his argument. So we share it or not, we can discuss this later. A rule-based world order underpinned by a set of well-functioning international institutions that enshrine fundamental values remains the best way to prevent competition leading to collision. Value-based realism begins with dignified behavior, with respect for the use of others, and an understanding of differences means collaboration based on partnership of equals. And finish, many obstacles lie before any attempts by the world's three spheres build a global order that once respects differences and allows states to set their national interests in a broader framework of cooperative international relations. It's the concept. So the question arises how we can construct this more stable, more rule-based order. And we can hear this in a little bit between the lines in the text by Stubbs, but also I think the text. The Canadian Prime Minister, there are certain expectations that the South could will give this to. The question is what is to be done, and the question may be from a Western or Northern perspective, what can the South do to rebuild this international order? And quite interestingly, in this Munich security report, I have some interesting questions and surveys referring to this question. So there is, for example, the questions in several points. The question was, what if anything do you think your country should do in response to other countries reducing their contributions to global problem solving, for example, mitigating global warming? And you see in India, 57% of the respondents say yes, the country should India should contribute more. China, we see on 50%. South Africa, Brazil is more skeptical. 35 say yes. And 35 says the same as before. But what we can see that comparing it with Germany, France, and Japan, there seems to be a certain willingness in the global South to take more responsibility in global politics in a situation where other countries, we see this, the United States retiring from forums, from obligations, are doing less. And there's also another question that was, do you agree or disagree with the following statement? Governments and people in other parts of the world want my country to play a more active role in solving global problems. And you see also in India, Indonesia, Turkey, but also Brazil, 60% say of the respondents have the perception there is also an expectation in other countries that their countries should do more for solving the international problems. And the further question, do you agree or disagree with the following statement? Countries that are asked to assume greater responsibility for solving global problems should be empowered in international organizations. Here we see the same, India, Brazil, the majority said yes, Turkey is a little bit more. You see, okay, these important countries of the global South, there is a willingness to do more in international politics, but they will also have more voting rights, more rights, more in international institutions. And this is also quite interesting. There was also the question on whether China's foreign policy delivers concrete benefits for countries around the world. There are view in Europe, you see Germany, France, Italy, very low, 25, 26, and the countries of the global South. The view of the possible role in this international order of China is much more positive in the global South compared to Europe and West, or the North, how we call it. And this is an interesting one, very the driving for a European. There was the question with which countries the country should prioritize when it comes to strengthening cooperation. Regarding the US, you see in Brazil, 36 say, okay, we should more cooperate more with Brazil, with the US, 23 with India, then we know 21 with China, 6 with Russia, and with the European countries only 8%. And if we look to India, also 23 say with the US, 28 with Russia, with Europe, 8. So in most of these countries, between 8 and 11%, they only say, okay, we should cooperate with Europe. The only country where more people, 24, say more cooperation with Europe is Turkey, but this has to do with its geographic location and the membership of Turkey in NATO. So let's skip this. So this is the view from the global South. So the expectation that rising powers or important actors in the global South do more for preserving or changing or stabilizing the international order. Another question, we see also that the expectations regarding the EU are not so high. The question is now, what's the vision of the EU? And I found this is a very new, there's a very recent speech by the President von der Leyen to the EU ambassadors on March 9, also 2 weeks ago. And I will also cite from this speech quite extensively. I'm not sure whether it really reflects the position or opinion of all the European countries, but it is a drastic change when you compare it with speeches of Commission presidents some years ago. And also, I'm now also from the line. It's difficult to play her. I tried. And she says, okay, Europe can no longer be a custodian for the old world order, but for a world that has gone and will not return. We will always defend and uphold the rules-based system that we had to build with our allies, but we can no longer rely on it as the only way to defend our interests or assume its rules will shelter us from the complex threats that we face. We need a clear-eyed and hard look at our foreign policy in today's world, both in how it is designed and how it is deployed. We urgently need to reflect on whether our doctrine, our institution, our decision-making, all designed in a post-war world of stability and multilateralism, have kept pace with the speed of change around the world, whether the system that we built with all its well-intentioned attempts of consensus and compromise is more a help or a hindrance to our credibility as a geopolitical actor. The point is that if we believe, as I do, that we need a more realistic and interest-driven foreign policy, then we need to be able to deliver on it. We have started a generational project, European independence. The goal is to make ourselves more resilient, more sovereign, and more powerful, from defense to energy, from critical raw materials to strategic technologies. Your work to deepen, de-risk, and diversify our partnerships around the world is invaluable into this. This is what independence looks like in today's world. It means not relying on a single supplier for vital assets, from energy to defense, semiconductors to vaccines, clean tech to raw materials. And for this, we need more connections with reliable, trusted partners, from the trade deals to the security partnerships that we have helped to broker. This is already making a difference. But we need to go further. We need to be prepared to project our power more assertively, for instance, to counter aggression and foreign interference with all of our tools, whether economic or diplomatic, technological or military, or by being much more pragmatic when it comes to doing business around the world. And Europe needs to get on to its front foot and start seizing the opportunities that are out there. Almost 2/3 of global growth is happening outside of the US and China. Countries across the continent are looking for their place in the new world. They do want to be part of, and they do not want to be part of any sphere of influence. They just want to be prosperous and sovereign. This is why they diversify their trade relation, because they too are hedging against dependency. From Central Asia to the heart of Africa, from Latin to Southeast Asia, vast parts of the world are looking for stability and trusted partners. This is our hallmark, our European offer. So as we look ahead, we must continue to seize these opportunities, putting our interest in front and center of our work. And to finish, Europe has peace at its core. It is at the heart of our treaty and at the center of our history. It remains an enduring mission for each and every one of us. In order to seek peace in today's world, Europe must be able to project power, to deter, to counter, to increase our influence. In simple terms, we need to invest in the means to protect our territory, economy, democracy, and way of life. This will be the heart of our new European security strategy. In all our assets and policy, we must mainstream security consideration. In fact, security must become the organizing principle of our action. This must be the default mindset, from defense to data, from industry to infrastructure, from tech to trade. Some may say we are stepping out of our comfort zone. Others argue that we should focus only on what is happening in our own borders. But the threats we face come from all directions and all domains, whether cyberspace. The point is that the world around is changing in incredible speed. Now Europe is changing too. I found this speech very interesting because before we saw this thinking about how to involve more the global south in finding solutions to these known challenges. And now this is a very highly realistic speed, putting interest first, values a little bit later. And although a very much securitized speech, security becomes much more important in European politics. But I have to admit, it's not only a European turnaround. I found this very interesting article also by self-reading in online media called "A World Without Illusions," where there's no hiding to the fact that we live in a very difficult world. Whereas 2 decades ago, I would have said that we lived in a world of opportunities. Today, we live in a world of difficulties. The world today is increasingly raw, so to speak. We may have never experienced such a stark international situation. And also, this has increased the risk of international politics. It has also exposed its real working. This is a world without illusions. And then he continues, the consequences for Brazil are profound. The country needs to develop a serious defense policy, not to confront major powers. We will never have the capacity to confront countries such as the United States, Russia, or China militarily, but to acquire a real deterrence capability. It is essential that external actors know that any aggression would entail significant costs and damage. The goal is to prevent Brazil from becoming a structurally vulnerable country, and this becomes even more relevant when we consider our strategic resources. This is in a possible scenario of international tensions between third parties in which access to Brazilian strategic minerals becomes relevant. The country must be able to defend its interests and sovereignty. This is just one example, but it illustrates a broader point. National defense, technological development, economic security have become inseparable. So in a certain way, we see also this more secularizing discourse on the Brazilian side. It's not only this discourse by von der Leyen. So it's like here and in the future, we will see much more military spending all over the world. We will see also much stronger focus on the strategic question. You see it also when there was the meeting between President Lula and the president of South Africa, Ramaphosa, some time ago. They were also talking about that the possibility of the capability of deterrence will become much more, especially for securing critical raw materials. The Brazilian has a lot to offer, and I think also the US has a certain interest to get access other countries to the EU and China. So, what are the strategies in this world without illusions? Our Sensor Marine had quoted. In classic international relation, we have different possibilities. We have the possibility of balancing, because I would say in the moment, with all this speaking about multipolarity, we have still certainly a hegemonic power with the US, at least when we look at the military capabilities. So I think balancing is only possible for China and Russia. We have this alliance between China and Russia against the US. For the rest of the countries, there are other options. I will speak a little bit of soft balancing, multi-alignment, this new concept of active non-alignment, where I'm quite skeptic, and this concept of hedging, but also the question of alignment and working with the US. This will start a little bit shorter as the other part. So what I found quite interesting, hard balance is not possible, but there is this old concept of soft balancing developed by T. Paul, colleague international relations in McGill in Canada, somewhere in Canada, is professor. And some years ago, he wrote this book on restraining great powers by soft balancing. And here in his book, the definition was restraining the power of aggressive policy of states through international institutions, concerted diplomacy via limited informal ententes, economic sanctions in order to make its aggressive action less legitimate in the eyes of the world, and hence its strategic goals more difficult to attain. And a few weeks ago, he literally take this idea. This is in a policy magazine from January, a very small comment by T.V. Paul, where he writes, restraining Trump's Americas, Carney's soft balancing needs global support. In a certain way, he takes out this speech by Carney, where I would also say that Carney has developed a kind of soft balancing model, and he means also the instruments of soft balancing, economic statecraft, especially the threat of reciprocal sanctions and denial, is also a potential tool for restraining the United States. I think some states did this. It's not easy in the relation to the United States. If more countries ignore US trades and pursue bilateral, multilateral trade agreements, the US economy would ultimately suffer. We see this strategy with this new trade and the signing of the EU-Mercosur agreement, which was pushed both by the European side but also, I think, by President Lula. And after stagnating for many years, now the EU has advanced this agreement with India, advanced with Australia, and as I see, also Brazil has advanced some agreements with other countries too. And then he continues, this is already occurring as Western countries hedge and rush to form economic partnership with China, India, and other emerging economies. Canada's trade diversification is part of this strategy. The US dollar could also weaken if more countries reduce their holding of debt instruments such as treasury bonds, potentially fueling inflation and turning public opinion against the Trump administration. While there will be short-term pain from Trump's tariff retaliation, personal tax inaction would also allow aggressive behavior to continue unchecked. So this is one possibility or one possible strategy in this new complicated world with a predatory hegemon US. This is kind of soft balancing. Another one is this very popular concept of hedging. It's a very interesting article by Matthias Spector, where he published 3 years ago, where he argues that this might be the best strategy for developing countries, this weak power strategy for hedging. What do we mean by hedging? Hedging is quite similar to the concept of fence setting. I prefer more hedging because fence setting is a little bit more proactive concept. Hedging is a more defensive concept. And there is one of the many definitions that you find about hedging by Puig. He has already a lot on that, and he contrasts fence sitting and hedging. And he writes, hedging can be defined as an insurance-seeking behavior under high stakes, high uncertainty, a situation where a sovereign actor pursues a bundle of opposite and deliberately ambiguous policies vis-à-vis competing powers to prepare a fallback position should circumstances change and characterized as a strategy of protection against negative effects or risk management with the objective to preserve the strategic autonomy of states. This reflects a little bit the source of hedging. It comes from economy, hedge funds, and this kind to minimize your risk when you are investing in different financial instruments. But I find some further elaboration of this concept. There's a very interesting paper by Hacke, where he says if you differentiate between hedging and balancing, say hedging is more a strategy responding to security risks. Balancing is more strategy if there's a real security threat. I think when the enemy is threatening with an attack, I think hedging will be sufficient. It would be better to get some ally. But if it's a risk and not a threat, this might be the best strategy. But what is also important, and there the concept becomes a little bit diluted. If you hedge, you have also be defined what are the ends and ways, means. Similar, if you look now at the war in Iran, if you start a war, you define what are your ends and means, and otherwise, as we see, there might be you get in trouble. And I think the same is also true for hedging. If you decide to hedge, you need a clear end, and also define your instruments and what you're doing. And I think in the case of most states, at the end is of minor or secondary states is to defend your territorial integrity, sovereignty, and political independence, and the survival of the political regime. But the practice, what we are doing, is varying. So it's as these authors argue, there is no clearly defined instrument. This is only hedging. But states have a certain memory of state availability in their and I had this long day flight from Lisbon to Rio, and for casualty, I got this new book here from Cambridge Elements on the hedgers. And reading the book, I noticed that this concept now becomes even broader. So in the end, we might be all now hedgers now, because these authors here, Saki Laidi and Gilles Tiberian, define hedging as a strategic. We refer to strategic hedging behavior as repeated, diverse, sustained, and complementary actions to engage with all major powers without reaching a formal alliance with any and without restriction and possible actions of others. Strategies of strategic action is proactive and includes bilateral strategic action plans, broader institutional arrangements, and active hosting of global forums. It also recoils from exclusive measures such as sanctions or boycotts towards any great power. So I think with this concept becomes even more diluted, and it becomes and they argue, and it is also argue, even if you use this strategy of hedging over time, you might become something of a hedger, and if there are many hedgers around the world, this will also have some systematic impact. I'm not really sure whether this is true. But the problem is that with this very broad definition of hedging, it is difficult to differentiate it from what we normally call multi-alignment, which is another strategy which is very attractive in the global south. I think it's especially a concept used in India. They use this concept very actively. And it also shows, in my opinion, in contrast to hedging. Hedging is more strategy for weaker powers or middle powers, but for emerging powers which have the objective to change the international order, multi-alignment might be the interesting strategy. And I think we are a little advanced, so I will only refer to this multi-alignment concept. We can go to this later on in the debate. There's also, I will not enter this in detail, an interesting article now also in Pornaface on this multi-alignment strategy in India, where he also demonstrates that it is not always easy. It's difficult because you have to play with different partners, and it may also from time to time create costs. So if someone is interested to copy this strategy of India, you should read this paper by this author. But for time reasons, I will leave this out. And then the next strategy is the question of bandwagoning. When you read now the literature on IR about possible strategies, or for example also this concept which I will present later on active non-alignment, you get the impression that aligning or bandwagoning is always a bad strategy. But I would argue from the perspective of certain countries, bandwagoning might be the best strategy if you can get a lot from the leader. This might be a better option. And if you look at Latin America, I think there's a lot of bandwagoning now in Latin America in alignment with the US. You see this new Escudo de las Americas, where a lot of right-wing politicians participated. They do not soft balance, and they do not hedge against the US. They engage with the US, and we can call this a kind of bandwagoning. And there are some colleagues, for example, Luis Quinoni, an Argentinian, who now is at the University College of London. In the case of Argentina, argues para países como la Argentina, que por su situación geográfica son especialmente sensibles y vulnerables a las sanciones norteamericanas, menos a las de China. Esto convierte el alineamiento activo en la única estrategia ganadora. If you're highly indebted with the US, it might be the better strategy to align with the US than to oppose the US. I think this is a big problem now in the world. I think we had a period of very permissive period of international politics, but today non-aligning is not cost-free. If you non-align, this may create cost with one or the other actor outside. So to come to an end, then there's this very popular concept of active non-alignment, promoted by Jorge Heine, an intellectual former ambassador to China, India, and South Africa. And with two Chilean intellectuals created this concept of active non-alignment, which is quite popular in some circles. And I think the question is whether it's really the most accurate concept for capturing the politics of Latin America, and what advantages it offers compared to other concepts. I think the basic idea is quite simple, that in the contestation and conflict between China and the US, the best strategy for Latin American countries should be to align neither with the US nor with China, to cooperate on a case-to-case basis. The question is whether it's really active non-alignment or whether it's a selective alignment, or I'm not sure. And I think, in my opinion, this concept has four basic flaws. I think it's the coherence of the concept. It's whether it's really applicable in practice, and the other, whether it's really anchored in the conceptual theoretical debate in international relations, and whether it's really, if you introduce a new concept, whether it's really better than the other concepts which are on the market. And I presented something about hedging, balancing. I have my doubts. So, perhaps more in details, I'm not sure whether it captures what many countries are doing. I think selective alignment or multi-alignment, as India is doing, this might be a better concept to define when a country is cooperating with different actors in the international system. On the other hand, the authors of this concept create a certain problem. It's never really clear whether it's an analytic. Sometimes they say it's an analytic concept that they use as a researcher, as an academic, or whether it's a doctrine, as a political concept, which it's very prestige. You offer it to your government and misuse it as a conceptual. And on the other hand, if all Latin American countries become active non-aligned, it's also kind of alignment, because they are all doing the same. So there's also some logic contradiction. And what I'm most missing, if you read the authors, they do not really engage with other concepts, with hedging. At the end, they're doing a little bit, but it's not really clear. And it also they demonstrate a certain Latin American realism, because there's broad debate, or has been a broad debate in Asia, a very complicated region with China, there with the US chair. There's a lot of debate on these concepts of hedging and so on. So I'm missing a little bit in the concept. And in the end, I think this is from the last book, where they say that this concept is a foreign policy doctrine with playing the field as a grand strategy, and hedging is a tactic of active non-alignment. And then they say the key point about active non-alignment is that is not a movement, but a certain type of foreign policy behavior that attempts to deal with an uncertain environment. This is the same what they also say when they use the concept. So I will come to the end. So in this turbulent and complicated world, what is the best strategy? I have no answer. I offered some food for thought. I found this a very interesting comment by Howard Grant. He's a student of military relations. He's a hardliner. It's written for the American Enterprise Institute, which is not a left-wing institute. And he writes, as the US remakes its alliance, the great global hedge is underway. Thus, hedging is the new normal. And similarly, in another article, he also says, as Trump first tariffs, shows contempt for international law and seeks territorial concession from allies, depends on an unreliable superpower, threatens to become an awful liability. Hence, the great global hedge is underway. And to end, this is from this book, which I mentioned before, which I read in my flight to Rio, where I asked myself at the end, are we all hedging now? And then he also writes, Trump has made unpredictability his preferred method of government. Hedging consists precisely in protecting oneself against the volatility and instability of international politics. Hedging integrates fluidity and volatility of international relations from the outset. That means that when one of the two dominant players in the world system develops an unpredictable policy, hedging becomes even more necessary. So, looking at Ursula von der Leyen and President Lula, I'm asking myself at the end, is this new relationship between Europe and Brazil, is this hedging? Is it soft balancing? Is it multi-alignment? Is it active non-alignment? I think with this question, I will close. Hope that in the question answers we might find some answer to this question. Thank you very much for your attention.
Thanks so much, Detlef. You've provided us certainly with a sweeping panorama of increasingly unattractive options. And I'd like to do just that, maybe a debate to bring this back to how all of this affects Brazil, how Brazil can act in this scenario. Right? And I find it quite interesting that you're seeing policy documents from the United States, policy documents out of Europe, but we haven't generated, beyond sort of the comments from Amorim and others, we haven't generated a consolidated policy response yet here because it's still maybe too unpredictable in the United States as well. So you've already said, I don't have the answers. So maybe we can collectively think about sort of how should Brazil respond to this scenario? How should the global South in general respond to this scenario? So with that, I'd love to open up the questions if there are any. Yeah, thanks. If you want to ask the question in Portuguese, we can translate as well.
Or slowly, if you speak slowly, normally.
First of all, everyone's listening. So first, congrats for the presentation, Professor. My question is, the second administration of Trump just only accelerates the inevitable of this destruction of the multilateral order, the multilateral cooperation, because from my point of view, this type of work depends for the, I think this word, self-display from the countries to cooperate and obey the international rules. So when Trump comes, they show, no, I don't want this, not true, I simply do whatever I want, and creating a stipulation for another country to follow the same example, and that's it. Thank you very much.
Anyone else? Here.
Hello, good afternoon. Do you prefer to speak English or Portuguese?
We espero for Portugal.
Yes, okay. So thank you for being here, Professor. In the beginning of your presentation, I believe you mentioned that the Trump administration is seeking the reintroduction of the Monroe Doctrine here in the Western Hemisphere, especially in Latin America. In your opinion, do you think that kind of dynamic, the power dynamic in the Monroe Doctrine would also apply to other regions of the world through steadfast alliances such as Israel and the Middle East? Or is the aspects of what's happening, these projects for that region different from Latin America?
Maybe we'll take three at a time.
Yes, it's three. One more.
Hi, Professor. So my question is, you said something which I didn't annotate if it was something you said actually, or was like a quote of someone else. But basically, that the liberal rules-based order that arose after World War II is dying, which is a statement I cannot completely agree in the sense that I don't think this like rules-based world order has ever truly existed as someone like coming from the global South. So I think what really is happening, this rearrangement that Trump's doing, simply the way like he has treated the rest of the world, like the United States, like for most of the time after World War II, the United States is also treating Europe now in this same way. So my question is actually something more complex than that. It's about how like we see the Cold War, right? The US used to topple governments and install its own puppet governments aligned to their interests. And what we see nowadays, after the 90s and especially in the 21st century, this century, we've seen Iraq, where obviously like the US toppled Saddam Hussein and installed a government. But after that, every time the US has meddled in the foreign governments, especially of like the global south, they seem to have changed their strategy. Sorry. And now we see something else, right? So like we see in Libya, especially like Libya is like sort of doesn't have like a national unified government to this day. We see like Venezuela, they simply not really change the regime. They seem to like change like to a more, a lot something more aligned to the US still, and like we see what they're trying to do in Iran. So my question is, do you think this is necessarily related to the end of the Cold War, where the US did not see the like this necessity of like having governments allied to them because like they see themselves as the world's only hegemon? And do you think, if that's true, if China will eventually gain this this role the US has not played, and the US will come back to eventually to the strategy of having like puppet governments, or if like you see like this continuation of like this new strategy of just like dismantling governments?
Very good last and very good question to answer. I expect that I would need more time, but I will come back to this soon. First, I think this was the question that I think there's a difference between Latin America and the rest of the world, because if we read the security document, the US in its self-defined role saying that okay, in Latin America this is our close neighborhood. This is not our first interest. And if you look the power asymmetries in Latin America with most of the small countries, especially in Central America, it's clear they are here the dominant power. And I think it's what happened in Venezuela to take out the president. It would be much more difficult in other regions for logistical reasons. It would be possible. So I think that I would say that there's a difference. And what they claim for Latin America is a certain exclusivity. They would like that Latin America trades only with the US, that there's a there are privileges for US companies. As far as I read the document, I didn't find similar claims for other world regions. Therefore, I would say that there's a difference. The other question is clear. I think in some of the documents which I presented, they most concede that the so-called rule-based liberal order was never perfect. There have been always double standards, and you mentioned a lot of examples there. Therefore, but in a certain way, it was a kind of rule by the US where they mixed up blunt power politics with some rule-based politics. So, but what we now have, we have only what's left always only power politics. So I would say there is a certain difference, but it was not only the US. I think on the one hand, I think during the Cold War there was no global liberal order, because we had the part dominated by the Soviet Union, dominated by the US. It was a split up world order, and in this small period of the 1990s, when a lot of people speak of the unipolar moment, then it was really a global liberal order dominated by the US, but with all these examples which you mentioned. But it wasn't only the US. The more powerful states had more possibilities to skip out of the principle of liberal order than the weaker states, as we have to admit. But I think the question is what to do. I think for the weaker states, this international so-called rule-based order had a lot of advantages. Gave them a certain protection, and perhaps therefore, I think we should try to really establish at least some parts. No? And I think there was one question. This was, I know, to a notice. Was your question answered or no?
The question about the Trump accelerates the dismantle of things, the national base movement.
Yes, it's really, I think this, as I said, this international order was eroding for a long time. We have on one, as you mentioned, the double standard of the Western countries, and we had also the invasion of Ukraine in 2014, where one of the basic principles of international law, the guarantee of territorial integrity, of sovereignty, was violated. No? So I think many actors work together to subvert this so-called liberal international order. And I think, as many of the documents say, or the intellectuals and academics that are cited say, it will not be possible to reconstruct it in a way as it had been before. It will be another type of international system, but perhaps speaking not about a liberal international order, but about international law to reestablish basic principle of international law, I think should be in the interest of most countries in the world.
Any other questions? Right there. Yes. Go.
I have a question. Related to the EU. I was thinking about this new direction that the EU is taking. What do you think about that? It might like even fragment.
Very well.
Do you hear me now? Okay. My question is related to the EU, and I think like this new direction that the EU is taking, more assertive one, can maybe fragment the EU already, as it's already vulnerable, I would say. What do you see about like the prospects of EU when they take this assertive new direction, whilst they're already competing like interests and competing solutions within the EU, in which case maybe some EU countries will withdraw from it and will like fracture, like make it even more vulnerable. And so I just wanted to ask you, what you think about the prospects of EU and if it might go back to just be an economic alliance, or it will develop to have more sovereignty.
We have over there, and then I think we'll have to close because of time constraints.
Well, first, I want to thank you for the presentation. And mine maybe is more of a general question, but I was wondering, like, as I'm interested in regionalism, what's the place of regionalism in all of this discourse that regionalism in regionalism we're talking about? Like, if I think about what have been said about Europe, can we think about maybe more of going in a stronger integration, but at the same time, we talk a lot about sovereignty and the importance of this nation state. So how do those two things go together? And the second thing, talking about regions in other parts of the world, like we talk about hedging and diversification with alignment, but how these strategies affect regions in other parts of the world, like if for example, Latin America that's trying to diversify these relations, like looking abroad to other countries, cannot these tear apart regional borders and then undermine again more any effort for regional integration? And so more in general was how these structural factors can influence the evolution of regionalism in the world in general.
I think our last question is up over there.
Good afternoon, thank you for being here. My question is based on the concept of peripheral realism that you discussed with Professor there about the United States intervention in Europe. Do you consider that the United States national defense strategy can legitimize the use of military power in our region as a central political instrument here in Latin America, how might this strategy of peripheral realism evolve? Are we facing a passive acceptance of the don't roll doctrine, or there is still any kinds of space or room for a coordinated resistance, especially from a regional power such as Brazil, but considering that this year we will have a presidential election and maybe Fábio Bolsonaro can be maybe the winner of this election? Thank you.
Sweet. Complicated question. Perhaps I will start with regionalism because it's one of the topics I have also been a lot I think. Maybe in the European case, I think this turbulent world, this world, is a part also an answer to this other question, and I think helps to strengthen regionalism, because for most countries in Europe it's clear alone they won't play a big role in the world. The only protection is to collect together. So I think for the moment, we'll say more about Europe afterwards. In Latin America, I'm very skeptical because we have, in a certain way, many of these regional processes died due to the political polarization between governments of different political color, and now I think we have this right-wing wave. I'm not sure whether there might be economic integration, but there's a big political project. I think you saw it at times for regional cooperation in Latin America. The only possibility that I see to foster more technical projects to cooperate in more technically defined health, for example, was quite successful during the time of the South American Health Council, because it's easier to protect this kind of cooperation from the changes of government and political conflicts between presidents. And I'm also not sure whether Brazil as a regional power is better with the region behind, or whether Brazil is strong enough as Brazil, and it's better to act on it of its own, because to work with a lot of smaller partners can also create problems. So I think in the mid-range, we will see more this kind of technical cooperation and less summit diplomacy. You saw it now, there was this CELAC summit in Colombia. I think only 2 or 3 presidents attended. So this shows this kind of regional cooperation is a little bit, for the moment at least, out. But there's still a lot of technical cooperation. I wrote a paper for this journal about regional cooperation published by in Sao Paulo, where the so-called consensus with Brazil, where Lula had invited in 2023 the other president to relaunch UNASUR. They did relaunch it, but afterwards there has been a lot of cooperation in certain sectors, so it might be in the future. But this bigger question of the turbulent international order, I think regional projects in Latin America will play a significant role, especially because we have the Trump doctrine now, and I think the US government is not interested in strong integration projects, and in the future with another president and with less attention, elements might change. So unfortunately, coming to the EU, I quoted this speech by Ursula von der Leyen, because I was also quite impressed to read this very realistic, interest-driven approach. I'm not sure whether this represents the opinion of the governments in the EU, but what we can see, we have a much stronger focus now on security, on defense in Europe. The times have changed. I always give this example. As in Germany, the party which was most pacifist against investment in arms before the Russian invasion of Ukraine was the Green Party. And after the invasion of Ukraine, now the voters of the Green parties are the most bellicist, most militarist. This shows that also the mind maps in Europe have changed. And from a European perspective, the war in Ukraine and Russia is perceived as a threat. And on the other hand, we have a partner in the US where we are losing trust and confidence that they will help us. And the consequence is that we have now more this kind of securitization of the EU discourse in international politics. And I just read yesterday that now also Volkswagen, which has problems to produce cars in Europe, is producing arms. So this is two types of arms systems. So we can see also this changes. On the other hand, yes, there are also it's not clear whether all governments share this in Europe. They might have some. The problem is Hungary. We all hope that in the next election, easier with Hungary in 3 weeks. But yeah, but I think there's this lesson of the Brexit, of the UK leaving the EU. This has produced, I think, the majority of the British now see this has produced more costs than benefits. And I think in any country, trying to convince your population that it's better to leave the EU than to stay, it's much more difficult also, I think. So, but there will be tensions. I think that we have governments which are more sympathetic to Russia, others more hardline. And another question regarding the relations with the US, it's a problem. The EU's 27 governments, you will have always have some kind of variety of opinions, but still I think the majority is supporting to stay here. I think I answered to all or something. Here. The EU answered your question. This was this peripheral realism. I think this was the paper I wrote with Andrea. No, we wrote it from a perspective. I would say, I think, as a Latin American country, and you have now this very aggressive politic of the US. The question is how to react to this. You can have the big discourse as what, for example, Petro did when there was this deportation of Colombian migrants to the US. They said, no, the US airplanes cannot land, and okay, and then the next day had to retract because the US said, okay, then we will restrict travel possibilities for Colombia. And you had the Brazilian strategy is that, okay, protesting in a diplomatic way, you have to accept the imbalance, but you have to defend your national interest. I think the basic national interest, this comes from this peripheral realism by Scutese. As a government, your basic interest should be the welfare of your country, the territorial integrity. Over the rest, you can discuss, and you should confront a stronger power only when it's about power interest of your country, not enter into a battle which is more symbolic and before fighting that you can only lose. So this was a little bit the idea that we developed. And I think for Argentina as a country, when you are highly connected with the US, what is the better strategy? To cooperate with the US or to oppose the US? I think you can get a lot of applause that you are with a critical discourse against US dominance and imperialism. But in the end, you have to pay your debts, and you will create more problems for your economy. So from an academic perspective, I can understand at least for the moment, for closer cooperation with Argentina and Brazil. This is another case. They played it very well. I think it's quite arbitral. And there was this when the US tried to get involved in probably this proceedings against Bolsonaro, but a very weak decision accepted. Peripheral status. Yeah, value-based realism.
Yeah. Great. I think for time reasons we have to close right now, but I'd like to thank President Nolte again and thank everyone for coming.
And how much